I'm going to go ahead and get started for everybody's sake of time. I know it's the end of the day. So welcome to the Carolina Community Coalition Research Series. My name is Emily Cato, and I have the privilege to serve as the Director of Healthy Campus Initiatives here at the University of South Carolina, and I'm going to be facilitating this afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. We're thrilled to have you here for this virtual webinar on learning more about the blurred boundaries between victimization and offending. It's great to see participants from across campus, and hopefully we'll have some folks join in from across the state. And we hope that you're as excited to dive into today's session as we are. Before I begin, I just want to review a few housekeeping items. Please make sure that your microphones are muted during the presentation. This will help to avoid any background noises that may be distracting. And then we encourage you to use the chat feature if you have questions throughout the session. Our team will be monitoring the chat so that we will ensure your questions get answered during that Q&A portion. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our distinguished speaker for today, Dr. Sarah A. Rogers. Dr. Rogers is a passionate criminologist and educator based at the University of South Carolina. With a PhD in sociology from Mississippi State University, Sarah brings a nuanced perspective to criminology, focusing on intersectionality, gender, and trans studies. Her research has been published in several journals and explores topics like victimization, queer criminology, and pathways to and from the criminal legal system for marginalized communities. An advocate for inclusive education, Sarah integrates feminist and queer perspectives into her courses, making complex social issues accessible and relevant. When she's not in the classroom or conducting research, Sarah spends time with her daughter, her elderly dog, and newly adopted one-year-old cat. Now let's get started. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Rogers.
Thank you so much, Emily. Yes, and in fact, I am doing this talk from my house because of my elderly dog who just turned 14, but had been home all day. So I needed to be here. And so you might see my newly adopted cat walking around. So all that's to say sorry in advance if that happens or if you hear barking. Thank you so much for that introduction. Yes, I feel like maybe I need to change some of that introduction with a little bit of what's going on in the political climate, and maybe I shouldn't be advertising that I teach on queer and trans studies. But that's not necessarily what today is about. So I am going to talk about some of my previous research on blurred boundaries between victimization, and I use quotation marks with offending because hopefully you'll see why throughout this, but who is labeling what is offending and what is not offending, and who we're putting in that category, and why we're not putting that, some people in that category, but we are with others. So with that said, I just want to give a brief, I'm so sorry. I think I just did something wrong. Okay. Overview. Can y'all still see me? Because I can't see y'all anymore. Emily, can you still see me?
Yeah, we can see you, Sarah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Brief overview. So I am going to talk about pathways to offending and why that matters for our community here. So the pathway to engaging in criminal behavior is often associated with having experienced victimization. And I'm going to talk about different victimizations and how they affect our students in our community later on in this presentation. But most theories, criminological and sociological theories that we have, really kind of look at offending as kind of a black and white issue, but more traditional, or excuse me, more progressive or nuanced theories, usually in the feminist criminological space, offer more of a complete idea of what it means to engage in crime and what's going on to make those decisions to engage in crime. And so I am going to talk about these blurred boundaries today. The main theory that I'm going to talk about today in brief is feminist pathways perspective. And this came about in the early 1990s when Kathleen Daly realized that a lot of these juvenile girls that she was interviewing who were in a juvenile detention center, the vast majority of them had experienced victimization. And she was like, something must be going on here. And that led to this whole new way of looking at engaging in offending. And what she found is that girls and boys experience victimization in different ways during childhood, and that affects their pathway into offending. And so girls more often have experienced child abuse and sexual victimization rather than boys, and that has a huge effect on whether they engage in offending later on in life. So some subsequent studies using this theory found that incarcerated girls are 3 to 4 times more likely to have been abused compared to boys. And in fact, in one California facility for juveniles, 92% of the girls housed there had experienced at least one form of abuse. And I'm going to talk about the different forms in a couple of slides. But the main form, especially when we're talking about juveniles, is child abuse. So in another study in a men's prison in New York, so not a juvenile detention center, but an adult correctional facility, researchers found that 68% of the men in that prison reported some form of childhood victimization, and that 23% of them experienced multiple forms of victimization and abuse, so neglect, physical, sexual abuse. In a similar study, researchers found that more than 90% of women involved in the criminal legal system have experienced some form of childhood trauma. So while the percentage is still very high for men, it's even higher for women. So still looking at child abuse, y'all can see in the highlighted portion of this chart, and this is an older study, but this is data collected by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, BJS. So it is governmental data, but again, it's very old. It's 25 years old. So we have seen an increase since then, but I thought this chart really gave a good overview. So if we look just at the highlighted portion in the purple box, we can see a breakdown. And it says ever abused before admission, so before you were incarcerated. And in the purple box, this is, have you been experienced abuse before the age of 18? And so you can see for state, for people in state correctional facilities, men, 14% experienced abuse before the age of 18, and almost 37% for women. And then federal prisons, jails, and probationers, so people who are under some form of correctional supervision within the community. They further break that down into physically abused and sexually abused, and you can again see this vast difference between men and women, 12% for men and 25% for women, and then sexual victimization, 5% for men and almost 26% for women. And again, that's for state, which is where most people engaged in the or involved in the criminal legal system are housed. Then, so child abuse being one kind of pathway or one form of abuse that people who have engaged in offending have experienced. The second is sexual victimization, as well as intimate partner violence, IPV. And so this is that same chart from BJS, but the different highlighted portion in purple now is over the age of 18. So have you ever been experienced abuse over the age of 18, but prior to being incarcerated? And you can see, especially for women, that number jumps up to over 57% have been previously victimized before entering the prison system. Overall, if you break that down, physically abused 46.5% for a woman and sexually abused 39%. So we see huge differences there between men and women. And this is exactly what pathways theory is saying. It's not saying that boys and then men don't experience abuse. Obviously they do, but that they experience it to lesser extents, especially in childhood. And so that those different ways, those different pathways of kind of leading to offending or labeled offending differs again between men and women. And then for intimate partner violence, most studies show that more than 70% of women who are incarcerated in prison and jail have reported experiences of intimate partner violence, victimization. So we're seeing different types of victimization across the board. Then homelessness is that kind of third pathway that we see often in the literature. I'm going to give you this overview, or I guess this broad stat, which is up to 15% of people currently incarcerated have experienced homelessness within the year prior to being incarcerated. That's a lot. Obviously, that has some significant impact on what is labeled offending. I do want to break it down a little bit because of my background and my type of research to say when we look at specialized or marginalized populations, we can find that 28% of queer youth, LGBTQ youth, reported experiencing homelessness or housing instability at some point in their lives. When we break that down even further and look at race, that number increases for queer youth who don't identify as white and non-Hispanic. And so it's, I'm sure a lot of y'all have heard the term intersectionality before, and I know a lot of people accuse it of being a buzzword, but it truly does look at the holistic picture because we're not just one thing, right? We're not, for example, I'm not just a woman. I'm not just a professor. I'm not just white. I'm not just non-Hispanic. I'm not, just a mother, right? I was in a same-sex marriage for 7 years. But all of these intersecting identities kind of comprise who we are, right? The fact that I'm a first-gen student is part of my identity. The fact that I am from the South, Alabama, and primarily have lived all over the Southeast, that informs my perspective. So all of these different intersecting identities kind of come together and affect us in different ways, especially as it relates to victimization and offending. And the final pathway I'm going to talk about is drug addiction, which does often go hand in hand with all of these other things. So we know that drug addiction, substance abuse and drug addiction is highly correlated with previous victimization. It is highly correlated with homelessness. Homelessness is also highly correlated to victimization. So this is like a really individually, these things matter, but also when we take the big picture, you can see a much more round idea of what's going on. And so sorry, I just realized, okay, the blue box, oh, it does say women. Okay, good. So between 69 and 72% of justice-involved women meet the criteria for substance abuse disorder, while 57% of justice-involved men meet the criteria for substance abuse disorder. And just so y'all know, when we use the term justice involved, it means people that are entangled in the criminal legal system. So they are under some form of, or they currently are or have previously been under some form of correctional supervision, whether that be prison, jail, or probation, parole, something in the community. So I'm going to take a little pause right there. I'm going to try to figure out how to get y'all back on the screen. It's been a while since I've had to do a Zoom presentation. But I did, whether I can see y'all or not, which hopefully I can, I did want to stop here and take some questions from y'all. Any questions or comments? Sorry. Okay. questions or comments about any of the terminology or the pathways? Okay, so I'm definitely in teaching mode. Let me get back to my PowerPoint. 1 second. Okay. With no questions, I'm going to move on and talk about this idea of intersectionality again, these intersecting privileges and oppressions within the criminal legal system. Mostly, I'm going to talk about oppressions rather than privileges. But you can see, right, when we talk about all these characteristics of ourselves, we can see where, you know, being a person of color is going to affect your arrest decisions, your sentencing decisions, your parole and probation decisions. Being a person within the queer community is going to affect those same decisions. Your citizenship and immigration status are going to be affected, or is going to affect those decisions as well. Because we do have disparity within the criminal legal system, just like we do in large scale institutions within our society. And so, kind of how I mentioned before, the definitions of what is deviant, what is criminal, does vary based on these individual characteristics. If it weren't, then every single person who committed the exact same crime would get the exact same sentence. And we know that that's not true. Especially again, as it relates to race and ethnicity. So I could talk for a week about the disparities within the criminal legal system, but I just wanted to give a couple of examples. So, for example, when talking about disparities and race and ethnicity, Black youth accounted for 16% of all youth within the US, yet they comprised 44% of all youth in juvenile facilities. So, obviously, we're detaining these juveniles of color at disproportionate rates than what they comprise of society. And Hispanic youth were 61% more likely than white youth to be in a juvenile facility. When we talk about race as well as gender and sexual identity, approximately 300,000 queer youth are detained each year, which is more than, of which more than 60% are Black and Latino. So we also have to talk about age. That's obviously a factor as well, where among Black men, those 30 years and under received longer and harsher sentences than middle-aged, so age 31 to 49. I don't love hearing that term, but middle-aged and men aged 50 and older. So youth, again, 30 years and younger, was a detrimental factor to their sentencing. For Hispanic men, young offenders receive lighter sentences than middle-aged men. So it's not prescribed by, or it differs by each race and ethnicity. So people aged 21 to 34 received the harshest penalties, while teens and older adults received the lightest penalties when you're talking about Hispanic populations. Sorry, that's a little unclear there. So another intersecting factor there is going to be socioeconomic status. So Black lower class men are disproportionately affected by, again, disparities in arrest, sentencing, and bail and community decisions. So this idea of not one characteristic, it's all these characteristics play a role in who is and isn't labeled as offenders. Now, I think to kind of clarify or put into perspective a lot of what I'm talking about, I'm just going to use one of my previous studies. So y'all can probably hear my dog crying in the background. I'm really sorry. So This actually was my dissertation study from 5 years ago. I'm sorry. I'm gonna let my dog out 1 second. I'm so sorry. So, um, this was actually my dissertation study where I interviewed two groups of trans men, primarily in the South. And the group I'm going to talk about today are previously incarcerated trans men. So transgender men are people who were assigned female at birth, but identify as men. And so at some point in their life, they either identified as or at least presented as a girl, like growing up, until they transitioned or identified as a boy or a man. And that's important for later on. So I talked to this one group, 15 previously incarcerated trans men. And of those 15 men, when we talk about these pathways to offending that I just went over, 9 of the 15 had experienced childhood abuse. 12 had experienced sexual harassment. 11 had experienced sexual assault or rape. And 10 had experienced homelessness, with 8 of those dealing with homelessness because they were rejected and kicked out by their family. So we see these pathways very much kind of creating a situation in which offending was more likely. Now, when I looked at it more closely, I realized that not only were these men experiencing at least one of these pathways, but the vast majority were experiencing more than one. So of those 15, only 2 experienced one pathway. So whether it was childhood abuse, sexual victimization, or homelessness. 8 of them experienced 2 pathways, and 5 experienced all 3 pathways: sexual victimization, childhood abuse, and homelessness. Because as I said earlier, homelessness, I also talked about drug addiction, but that's later on. But homelessness is very much tied to previous victimization. Childhood abuse is very much tied to later on sexual victimization. So these all are kind of tied together. But you can see how one can absolutely lead to another. And so another one of the takeaways from this is that many of the men that I talked to used negative coping mechanisms to deal with the trauma that they had faced. So whether that was engaging in crime, selling drugs, for example, which was a large portion of why these men were arrested, selling drugs, getting a DUI, one man was in Florida, arrested finally after being stopped by police several times for sleeping on a bench in a park because he was homeless. And then they arrested him on the fifth citation. So that's kind of the ways in which offending tied to this and why people engage in offending. Another negative coping mechanism is avoidance of the problem. So just like ignoring that the victimization had happened, and moving away or distancing themselves from friends or family. And then a third more common negative coping mechanism was drug use. So what does all of this pathway stuff and my previous research and everything that I've talked about so far, what does it have to do with our community, whether that's on campus or in Columbia? And that's where I kind of want to spend a little bit of time. So as of, and I don't have the updated numbers, I'm sure someone probably here on this call does, but as of the first year students in the 2020-2021 school year, 16% of USC students identified as queer, LGBTQ. That's actually a little bit below the reporting average by generation within the US. So I did add this Gallup from 2023, which I thought was really interesting. to talk about self-identification as LGBTQ by generation. And we can see that our students here, born between 1997 and 2012, 22.3% of people in the US in that generation, Gen Z, identify within the queer community. So these things like being kicked out or being rejected by their family, that's absolutely affecting at least 16%, if not more, of our student population. Let me go to, while USC unfortunately isn't as racially and ethnically diverse as several of our peer institutions within the South and within SEC, we do still have 30.4% of our student population who identify as something other than white and non-Hispanic. So that is a third almost of our students who are dealing with the discrepancy or the disparity, excuse me, within the criminal legal system, who are more likely to be stopped, who are more likely to be arrested, especially if that factor, that race and ethnicity, is overlapping with a sexual or gender identity that is minoritized. Um, so how can we help? Like, what are some resources? Obviously, we cannot go back in time for our students at least, to prevent childhood victimization. They come to us, as 18, plus year olds. So we can't go back in time to prevent the childhood victimization for them, but we do have resources on campus that can help deal with that, or at least address that, so that they can avoid, hopefully, negative coping mechanisms like I talked about previously. So I can definitely send this PowerPoint out. I don't know if y'all want me to take you to these websites, but obviously OMA has great resources that deal with minoritized populations. Sape is one that I really did want to talk about, and I don't know, maybe it'll let me. Let me see if I can. Yes. So Sape, sexual assault and violence intervention and prevention, does deal with incidents that happen now, like currently, but also have a plethora of information about resources if you have experienced victimization in the past. Obviously, why we're here today, substance abuse prevention and education, SAPE, has a ton of those resources as well. I also, because we are talking so much about the community, not just our campus community, but the Columbia community at large, I wanted to give some larger resources for there as well. So the Harriet Hancock Center, and I am going to take you there, is a great resource for everyone, friends, family, and people who identify in the queer community. They have peer support programming. They have lawyers attorneys that they work with. They have community events. They have free meals for people. They have, I'm trying to think of all the things off the top of my head. Resources for homelessness. Again, this is for, excuse my dog, for people who have experienced those negative pathways because of their identity. 1 second, I'm so sorry. That's embarrassing. I'm really sorry. Again, she's 14, so I can't, it is what it is. Another resource is SCIDVASA, which is a horribly long acronym, but it's the South Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. And they have so many resources, especially for people who have experienced victimization, who need to leave that house, that domestic relationship, whether that's parents, roommates, intimate partners. And so they do work with different agencies to provide temporary housing. They have, grants that help get job experience. They have so many resources available, and they're such a great community partner, especially with the university. And then I know that there are a ton more resources for substance abuse, but I did want to take you to one of the main links, which is the Department of Alcohol and Other Drug Abuse Services. And again, this is a community, partnership, not necessarily on campus. Of course, Sape is going to be great for our campus, faculty, staff, students, but I did want to put this there as well. And so why are resources important? And it's all about addressing those pathways. If we can address those pathways to offending, like drug abuse, homelessness, what for whatever reason, sexual victimization. Again, child abuse is really difficult because we don't get these students until they're 18. But if we can address some of those to prevent, future offending, these are the types of things that we can use as in our toolbox to do so. And so I really did like speed through that. I know I kind of had about 40 minutes to talk, and I'm only at 32, but I want this to be, as I expect my classes to be, more of a discussion. I just wanted to give you all the broad overview and then open up the floor for discussion. So that's, see if I can figure out how to see y'all again and stop sharing a screen. Okay. Yeah, I'd love to hear from y'all. And y'all, a lot of y'all, I know several of you on here, work on a much more hands-on basis with our students. Obviously, I'm in the classroom every day, but I feel like y'all have a lot more personal connection. So I'd love to get feedback and just have a conversation.
So Sarah, our first question is, do you have any books that you suggest for further reading?
About pathways? I see that's Anna Catherine. Is it like about pathways or about what exactly about Anna Catherine? I mean, yes, there's always books. Is the broad answer, but if you tell me exactly what you're kind of thinking about, so you're familiar with trauma and ACEs and how they contribute, but I'd like to learn more. Yeah, definitely. ACEs are a big part. And so those are, for those of you who don't know, ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. Again, these things that I was just talking about, like pathways. Um, yeah, shoot me. Well, I've been meaning to stop saying that. Send me an email. It's hard for me to think off the top of my head. There's a great TED Talk with Nadine Burke, Dr. Nadine Burke, about ACEs. And she gives such a great overview of what those are and how they affect not only children, but as they grow into adults. And I always love showing that TED Talk because it really is so informative, but I'll need another second to think about exact book titles. But yeah, Dr. Nadine Burke TED Talk, I highly recommend it.
All right, so another question is, how can we best support people who are victims or survivors in order to prevent them from offending in the future?
It's if you're that's such a great question. So there are a lot of ways to do that. It's hard to do that unless that person, you kind of have a relationship with that person and you can see that they're struggling or maybe making some questionable decisions, not offending decisions, but like you can kind of see where their behavior is going. So if it is someone that you know, or it's a student that you have and you see them kind of sliding, I think, especially if it's a student on campus or someone on campus, I think the first place um, to refer would be to our mental health services, which our students get 6 free sessions. I also think that in partnership with a community, partner is always good. I did not put Pathways to Healing on there, but they're a great community resource. Skidvasa does not do direct, like, mental health services. They have those, like, they're kind of like a pipeline to services. So they can be like, we know who to put you in contact with to address things. So they're kind of like the middleman in that situation. But I would say if it is someone on campus, the first person I would call, or the first place I would call, is mental health services, and see, because so much of what they're struggling with is that victimization and how to deal with it, and how negative coping mechanisms may be taking over. And so the tools that the mental health center can give you are more positive coping mechanisms. And I think that that's a great first step. Yeah.
That's a great point, Sarah. I do want to jump in about the 6 sessions. So just so everybody on
Oh,
the
yes,
call
thank you.
knows, yeah, no worries. Just so everybody on the call knows, for students who have paid the student health fee, there is no cap. It's really more of a conversation between their provider and the student on what is needed for their care at that moment. And so it becomes more less of a cap, more of really a holistic approach to that. So thank you, Zakila McRae, for putting that in the chat as well. And I've also linked the mental health services page, so you can
Awesome.
see all of the weekend, after hours, and all of the things that are in there as well. So just wanted to
No,
tag in for that.
I'm also a faculty senator, and we just discussed this, I mean, not too long ago, and I don't think that that is widely known at all, because that is not what the conversation was in faculty senate. So that is amazing information, and I'm super glad that we moved to that model. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a brand new 4 days in executive director of mental health services. So that may be somebody to have at Faculty Senate so that he can talk a little bit more once he gets his feet on the ground. So talk a little bit more about kind of where we are and what we offer for our students. So that's great. Question number 2, I don't see one in the chat, so I'm going to move to my list, is what changes would you like to see in the criminal justice system to better support victims and survivors? I know.
Well, I'm trying to think what the appropriate thing to say is. I want to be like, abolish the criminal legal system. No, I'm just kidding. That's so great. So we know that actually programming, while a lot of counties and states say that programming is available, for example, substance abuse programming, IPV, interperson or intimate partner violence, programming, job skill set programming, they all say that that's available. While we found in the research that very few people actually experience having those resources while incarcerated. So I think actually following through with what the, DOJ says that they do provide, Department of Justice says that they do provide, because I do think that that's, super important. A lot of people who have experienced victimization, sexual victimization, as well as intimate partner violence, don't necessarily recognize that that either is defined as that, or they don't realize how big of an impact it has had on their life. And so having those programs available, while it doesn't go back, right? We can't erase what happened and we can't undo the offending. It can be such a great learning tool for when they are released, because ultimately, like 95% or higher of people who are incarcerated are eventually released back into the community. So we want those people to be set up for success. So I think having programming available is absolutely imperative.
Next question is, in your research, have you come across DOJ's STAR program applied in a higher education context, such as respondent services? If so, do you think USC could apply something similar? This would likely involve our counseling and psychiatry folks, as well as Office of Civil Rights and Title IX as well.
So I don't know, of that, only because, and I guess I should have said this at the beginning, I actually, am a victimologist. So all of my research involves people who've experienced victimization, and I don't really do the offending side unless it is relative to kind of these blurred boundaries. So I don't know a ton on the offender side or the DOJ side. So I don't know, but that sounds great. And I guess what I think sounds great is like integrating anything on this larger scale that's going like to our campus community, and involving multiple programs. I think I'll stop there. I can go on forever about bringing everybody in together at the same table, but for right now, I'll stop. I'd love to hear an explanation of the STAR program, if you don't mind. While we have a silence, I'm going to let my dog back in. Sorry.
And for anybody who's still with us, please feel free to unmute and join the conversation
Yeah.
outside of the chat if you're able to.
Thank you, Valencia, for posting the Title IX and the Victim Services page for the USCPD. I really appreciate that. So, is it Kirsten?
Kirsten.
Like, obviously you can send me Kirsten. Okay, send me an email. Yeah. No worries. If you want to send me an email, I would love to talk about this more.
Sarah, do you mind if I pose a question to the group?
Please.
I don't want to steal your thunder.
Oh my God. I have no thunder. Take it away.
So this one is really more for the group. How can we apply the principles that Sarah talked about today to promote bystander intervention on our campus, within our campus community, to improve campus culture here at USC?
And has anyone done or not witnessed, but experienced a bystander intervention, talk at USC? Do you know how to bring them in to get them to do that presentation?
So since Anna Catherine and Kirsten are in a shared space, I'm gonna vouch for them. So we do have Gamecock Stand Up, which is our bystander intervention training program across campus. And so I'll drop a link so that you can learn a little bit more about what the training program is. But Kirsten leads that effort for our office here at Healthy Campus Initiatives and Sape. So I will get you guys that. And then on the other side, Anna Catherine's work revolves a lot around healthy relationships and consent, which I think ties in really nicely with a lot of the principles that we talked about today. So Kirsten has dropped their email address and they're happy to connect with folks. But just want to make sure that I get that request a presentation information for you guys as well.
And I've had my students, do that. I've had people from Save Up come into my classroom. I've had people from Skidbasa come into my classroom. I really do try to promote this, like, I guess idea or sorry, that we can prevent future victimization as well as offending. And it needs to be on a structural level and a large community partnership, both on campus and off campus, rather than like an individual level thing. But bystanders on an individual level are super helpful, absolutely, and that training is so great. But it needs to be integrated more structurally as well.
I will say, Jenna, who is our Assistant Director of Coalitions here at Sape, is not with us today. She's at a conference. But one of the things that the Carolina Community Coalition is doing this year, one of our goals is to really kind of incorporate and figure out what that programming looks like related to bystander intervention, and come at that from a more systemic approach rather than just on the ground level. So what are we impacting kind of at that 50,000-foot view, as well as all the way down through those trickle-down effects? So USC has started that process, and really looking forward to seeing the progress that we make over the next several months.
That's awesome. Thanks, Emily. Any other questions or just comments? Anything about me or anything else? I mean, I'm an open book if you have any questions. It doesn't have to be about this presentation. You can ask me about anything.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
I just want to say thank you for your research. We all hope that college can be a disruptor to these systemic problems that you're researching. And I just appreciate you sharing the data, the percentage of students that are on our campus, and that it's a very real intervention that we have the opportunity to influence here at USC. So thanks for your research and your time today.
Thank you, Ambra. Anything else? I'm happy to like stay on the call too. Like if anybody doesn't want to ask in front of a bunch of people, I can stay on the call a little bit later.
Sarah, can you drop your email address in the chat so that if folks wanted to reach out individually, they have your contact information?
Yes, I meant to put that on the PowerPoint, but and just in case y'all don't copy it here, I'm in the Department of Criminology. So you can find me on the website there.
And is email the best way to reach out usually?
Yeah, it is.
Perfect.
Thank y'all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And I mean, any chance that y'all have that you want to collaborate on something, I'm happy to do that. I mean, I'd love to be more involved in the campus community. So let me know if y'all have something you want to work on together.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for your insightful presentation today. It was really engaging, and I had learned a lot. I learned a lot today, so thank you for that. And if anybody else has any questions, we do have Sarah's information, and Jenna will be sending out probably a recording of this. So hope everybody has a wonderful conclusion to your Thursday. Safe drive home. And all the best to your dog, daughter, and cat.
Thank you. I'm really sorry about that. Like,
No worries. It's 2025. Life happens.
Y'all have a great night, and I'm gonna stay on just a little bit just in case, but otherwise, thank y'all so much.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Emily.